Welcome everyone to the September 2019 Tanho Monday Textual Study. I am your host, Shirley Paulson of Early Christian Texts, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. The topic this evening is Vulnerable Divinity, an innovative approach to God in the 21st century from an early Christ movement. This is part 2 of our discussion on the text known as the Thunder Perfect Mind. Our focus tonight is on a subject that has been very troubling for many people, trying to understand divinity as both all-powerful and all-loving. Our text tonight introduces a full-blown picture of a vulnerable God that may help us make sense of divinity for 21st century people. Just a gentle reminder that donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. The donation link, the text we're studying tonight, and more information about the past and future study sessions can be found on the Early Christian Texts website by clicking the button on the home page that says Tanho Monday Textual Studies. So Hal, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Shirley, and thank you all for being here. I think that, Shirley, you have summarized really what I'm wanting to speak to this evening, and it is in the context of this early Christ movement church or text called the Thunder Perfect Mind. For those of you who have not read the Thunder Perfect Mind, I encourage you to. It's been one of the most popular of the Nag Hammadi texts that were discovered in the mid-20th century. And this text is basically the voice of a divinity or of a divine figure who is primarily female, not completely, but primarily female, and it is her voice alone. So this is a part of a larger kind of ancient text, and those ancient texts in the first several centuries, both Christ-related and non-Christ-related, have the figure of a divine figure who speaks by herself in the form of what one might call the great I am. So, in other words, this is a text that has simply the words of a divine female figure. We don't know her name except I am, and we've had a study of this text 2 months ago to get the basics to it. This evening, I'm mostly going to be talking about a book that I'm in the process of finishing, applying this to what I think of as the most severe theological problem of our time and maybe of much time. So basically what we'll do tonight is look at the voice of the Thunder Perfect Mind as a vulnerable divine voice. And I want to make that text fairly thoroughly with the text itself. But I think it's probably first important for us to take consciousness of what's happened in the last, I want to say 75 to 80 years, especially in the Western world. And that is primarily illustrated by the holocaust of Jewish people in the Second World War. This has really caused one of the biggest sets of questions or crises of all divine speech, I think. And I want to propose that the Thunder Perfect Mind knows about this problem in its own time and as a fairly thorough address to these issues and problems. But the main issue here about talking about God at all, I think, in our day, is primarily this, that, and to put it plainly, if there is a God that claims to be all-powerful and all-loving, how in the world could the Holocaust of Jewish people, the murder of 6 million people, happen? This is a question that came upon many people as the Holocaust of Jewish people was happening and immediately afterwards. In other words, it seems that the standard identity of most monotheistic gods is in tatters if one takes seriously the murder of 6 million Jews. In other words, especially since the standard monotheistic God claims to be all-powerful and all-knowing. So let me just walk us through the obvious, and forgive me for being pedantic, but if 6 million people are killed by, in this case, Nazi Germany's forces, and nothing is done about it, what happens to the idea that there is an all-powerful and all-knowing God? And I would want to say many people in the last 75 years have said, more or less, that's it for that kind of God. And I would say the major crises of most of the religions that have an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God are actively in crisis now. That is, there doesn't seem to me to be any answer at all. And I don't know, frankly, of any theologian since the Holocaust that has any answer to that. We can go into this at further length if we want, because in the writing I'm doing, basically I've gone through all of the attempted responses to this horrible tragedy. And I think that basically none of them work in terms of this kind of all-powerful and all-loving God. But I want to say a couple of other things. This is not about just the killing of so many million Jews. This is about something that now is a larger consciousness. That is, there's more than just the Jewish Holocaust that has had the same thing happen. So for me right now, the most recent that almost the entire Western world is ignoring is that millions of people in the last 25 years have been killed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That is, at least in terms of numbers and tragedies, that is in the same kind of realm as the Jewish Holocaust. But then you also look at what happened in Cambodia 30 years ago, what has happened to the native peoples of the United States and elsewhere. Again, we're talking about millions of people being killed by very violent and powerful people. So this is what I want to say, is that the consciousness in the 20th and 21st century about what I would call the decline of all-powerful and all-loving God is thorough. It's not just about Jews. And that what we have across, especially I would say Western consciousness, is simply an increasing amount of people who say, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to stop, as I do in our talks every Monday night, the fourth Monday night of each month. I'm going to stop every 10 minutes or so and ask for your protests, your questions, and your thoughts. So before I go on to lay out how the Thunder Perfect Mind, I think, addresses most fully of any document I know the crisis of the Almighty and all-loving God. Let me just stop and see what you all think. Just not about thunder yet, but about the challenge of the theological challenge or the spiritual challenge of divinity itself.
Well, Hal, I think, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yep. You probably would want to be aware that at your Union Seminary, there was an article written in 1987 by Stephen Gottschalk, who argued that Mary Baker Eddy's work addresses this question. In the Union Seminary Quarterly Review, he writes about theodicy after Auschwitz and the reality of God. Mm-hmm. And you might be interested in looking at that to just contribute new thoughts to your research on this, because he's arguing that yes, Auschwitz changed everything, and of course Mary Baker Eddy wrote these things, her work before this, but still he addresses the question from her theology in a way that I think is useful to think about. So I just bring that to your attention. It's in the 1987 volume, well, let's see, 61, numbers 3 and 4.
Of what?
Of the Union Seminary Quarterly Review.
Oh, okay. I've written in that many times.
I know you have. Yeah. That's why I'm saying this is your journal here. So.
Thank you. This is one of the many things that I don't know, Shirley. So I don't know of that work, yeah. And I'd be happy to look at it. I would probably, at the moment, say that my general impression, without knowing this and other things, it seems to me that there has been no prominent public way of thinking about God that's different than God is almighty and all loving. Mm-hmm. And that simply goes on in a smaller amount in Western civilizations, but that keeps going on as if all of these terrible slaughters did not happen.
Right. Well, and that's obviously the question of theodicy, and that's such a terrific subject to be probing from all angles. So I'm so grateful you are.
And I'm wondering, Shirley, if you have some other thoughts this evening on that, that'd be also really great.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Other thoughts, questions, protests?
Hal, how would you say your work or your perspective compares with Jack Caputo's Weakness of God?
Yes, actually, the book that I'm preparing has a chapter on Jack Caputo. So thank you. I think he's the only person who begins to think about it thoroughly. I do think he's the best there is. The interesting thing about Jack's work, as I understand it, is that it is the weakness or even the non-existence of God. That is God's defense. And I think that's a really lovely and powerful beginning to thinking this through. What Jack's work does not do is take directly on in the loss, pain, and suffering of humans. He certainly is trying to work towards that, but he's primarily staying in a theological realm, which I think is very important. I think what I'll say soon is that that the thunder is much more direct than Jack. Jack's a theologian and one of the best there is, and I think his work on it gives us, it certainly has given me a lot of things to lean on. So you picked the one person that is almost an exception. Thank you. All right. Well, I want to just now read you some things from Thunder, and I'll just stop after a while and talk a little bit. But these are not all. These are just a set of quotes from the Thunder Perfect Mind that lay out the heart of Thunder's address to who God is in terms of human suffering. She says, I am the first and the last. I am she who is honored and she who is mocked. I am the whore and the holy woman. I am the wife and the virgin. I am he, the mother and the daughter. I am the limbs of my mother. I am a sterile woman, and she has many children. I am she whose wedding is extravagant, and I didn't have a husband. I am the silence never found. I am the idea infinitely recalled. I am a barbarian among barbarians. I am a foreigner and a citizen of the city. I am the one who prepares the bread and mind within. So here it seems to me, just as you begin the Thunder here, there's no denying its power and its novelty, but thinking about what it can mean for people in the 21st century has in many ways only begun, as far as I can see. Not much work has been done on what it might have meant in the ancient Mediterranean. Most people don't know it at all, and that clamors for an initial introduction. Some of the things are clear about this 9-column papyrus. The voice is strong and calls attention to itself. It speaks almost entirely in the first person I voice. The very beginning demands and almost pleads to be heard. Here she is again. I was sent out from power. I came to those pondering me. Look at me, audience. Hear me. Don't chase me from your sight. Be careful. Do not ignore me. This voice does not mince words. I am she who is honored and she who is mocked. I am the whore and the holy woman. I am a barbarian among barbarians. I am she whom you detested, and yet you think about me. This person also seems to make unusual connections inside herself. I am the wife and the virgin. I am she whose wedding is extravagant and I didn't have a husband. I am she who is disgraced and she who is important. I am the deliberation of both the Greeks and the barbarians. I am a foreigner and a citizen of the city. She has much power, speaks her own truth even when it is not easy, brings different persons and characteristics together in herself, and enacts surprising connections. These divine characters point toward the obvious, even though the voice is quite original. She must be divine. Here she is again. I was found among those seeking me. Look at me, all you who contemplate me, those expecting me, receive me. I am the first and the last. I am the silence never found. Do not be afraid of my power. I am the one who prepares the bread and my mind within. I am what everyone can hear and no one can say. From the ancient perspective, this voice is like many other Mediterranean divinities that speak in the voice of the great I Am. The Hebrew God revealed himself to Moses as I Am, and later Ben Sirach writes of how divine wisdom herself proclaims, I am like a vine putting out graceful shoots. The Egyptian goddess Isis often spoke in long strings of I Am statements about how powerful and wise she was. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks 14 times as a great I Am. The voice in thunder belongs to well-charted divine beings. At the same time, this divine voice does not fit a typical divine voice from the 2nd century, or for that matter, it doesn't fit the conventional talk about God in the 21st century. What this divine person says is provocative and uncomfortable alongside conventional ways of talking about God. This voice actively compares herself to characters who are slandered. She says that she is both a whore and a holy woman. The only one in the whole poem where she compares herself is just one person, and that is to a barbarian. No self-respecting god or goddess would refer the divine self like this. She compares herself to foreigners, women who do not have children, and women who do not take a husband. She not only actively associates with those who are slandered, she calls herself one of them. This is disturbing to most conventional deities who are above all holy, pure, and without moral or physical blemish. At least as surprising is that she makes no claim to being almighty, even though she is clearly powerful. She proclaims unashamedly that she is disgraced, stripped bare, and thrown to the ground. This divine one, while knowing that she is powerful, does not care whether she has all power. As she says, I am she who exists in all fears and in trembling boldness. So, this is a startling deity, almost unheard of. For our purposes, this is a vulnerable divinity fully formed. Thunder does not present herself always as female, in contrast to so many kinds of divinities who are supremely male or female. She speaks about herself a bit queerly. As is obvious so far, she thinks of herself mostly as female. She calls herself wife, whore, virgin, sterile, midwife, bride, and slave woman. Over the entire poem, she refers to herself at least 25 times as she. On the other hand, even within the first 7 verses of the poem, she calls herself he, the mother. Later, this divine voice says, I am he whose image is multiple in Egypt. I am he, the one you thought about and you detested me. I am he from whom you hid. And I am he, the defense. So thunder is not like the current fashion in some circles, portraying a divine figure alternately as he and she. Rather, the thunder voice seems mostly female and a little bit male. And as she has been clear from the beginning, thunder actively scrambles what is meant by conventionally as a woman or female when she talks about herself simultaneously as the bride and the bridegroom. It is my husband who gave birth to me, and I am my father's mother, my husband's sister, and he is my child. Here, she is actively confusing the conventional gender rules, especially within families, as when she names herself he, the mother. She also actively evokes her husband who gave birth to me. This is neither nonsense nor randomness, but clear consciousness of the many ways genders get bended, often for the better. This is a commanding voice, an almost unimaginably sure and strong person in her own right, and one that keeps the hearers on their toes. As her occasional masculinity brandishes itself, she keeps pointing to, even toys with, the many caricatures of women. She does not shrink from these insulting terms for women, but takes them into herself with bravery and humor. Here the thunder voice scrambles the expected role of women, claiming for both her divine self and women, in general, much fuller, more complex, and more playful identities. Here she is again. I am she who is honored and she who is mocked. I am the whore and the holy woman. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the limbs of my mother. I am a sterile woman and she has many children. I am she whose wedding is extravagant and I didn't have a husband. I am the midwife and she who hasn't given birth. I am the comfort of my labor pain. It is this gripping, evocative, close at hand divine female that has already captured the imagination of hundreds of thousands of 20th and 21st century spiritual seekers. And yet it turns out that these already hailed aspects of her only scratch the surface of who she is. Before it is possible to see all that thunder offers, I must look fully at the ways the traditional all-powerful and all-living God has not been able to address fully the human experience of devastation, pain, and heartbreak in the last 80 years. Here, it's important to look at all of the ways that this devastation and pain has happened. So I'll just hold there, folks, for a bit, and I will see what you think about thunder in relationship to the issue of the divine, all-powerful, and all-loving.
I'm wondering, because of the sort of all-encompassing sense of being that is represented within this text, if it isn't nudging us towards realizing a more spiritual realm as opposed to this human one we know, which does seem so flawed and which does have issues like the Holocaust, like other horrible situations happening here on Earth. If it isn't trying to give us a bigger picture that there is another realm that we might not be able to see here and now and know, but that in that other realm, we have all this good. We are all united in being. There isn't separation, and well, that's enough.
Oh, that's really a very helpful answer. And I think I would do two things. One is say, yes, I do think that this is a presence that asks humans to be more spiritual than they ever have been. I don't think, however, that this kind of divinity actually hides from pain, loss, and devastation. And I'll quote from her a little bit later on that as well. But yes, I think that what I'm wanting to do is saying that the theologians of the last 500 years simply have not been hard enough at work about how we spiritually need to respond to the devastation and loss within humankind. Oh, wait a minute.
I like the idea that although it never says I am all powerful, I am all loving, what she's defining as all powerful is not this one concept of power, but the power is in all of us. Power is in the wife, power is in the virgin, power is in the mother, powers in everyone, and that all power is expressed in all of us in a very different way, and you can do the same thing with all loving. I just have to say that I've also been reading Siddhartha at the same time as I was thinking about this, and that's what I feel a lot of what Siddhartha's journey is to redefine what love is in all different kinds of ways. And so maybe what this is not negating that God is all powerful and all loving, but expanding what does all powerful mean and what does all loving mean.
Well, this is so exciting. Just to notice, our first two questions are so powerfully thoughtful on this, and so we're getting right to the heart of a lot of this. So thank you so much. Let me respond. It's been a while since I've read Siddhartha, so I'll just say I don't remember enough to be as present to your reading as I can. But I think the question about power that you raise, in other words, if I hear you correctly, it's that in fact you want to say no, all power still is here. It's just dispersed more thoroughly. Would that be?
Yeah. I would say that, or when I think of a God as omnipotent, I have this one picture of what omnipotent is, and I think that what this is doing is expanding how to define that all powerful by all the human actions that we do.
And would you say that that's adequate to the losses and devastation that humanity experiences?
I can't tell you adequate. I can say that might be an answer for some people that are struggling, is to be aware of a different way of thinking about things. So I'm kind of agreeing with you in that the Christian concept of omnipotent and all-loving God does need to be developed, needs to be thought deeper.
Thank you. You're on your toes. That's a wonderful, nuanced response. I've been working a lot with the work of Etty Hillesum. Some of you may know. She wrote an extended diary, basically as she died under the Nazis, and she there has also proposed that there is a kind of diffuseness that she feels in touch with even in the camps. But I want to, I think I probably should read another part of Thunder to expand our conversation here, because my other thought about power, I think basically best comes from her. And let me read you a little bit more of that. She says, Do not throw me down among those slaughtered viciously. In my weakness, do not strip me bare. She's also attacked a lot in the text. Do not be arrogant to me when I am thrown to the ground. Do not stare at me in the shit pile, leaving me discarded. Do not stare at me when I am thrown out among the condemned. Do not laugh at me in the lowest places. I am she whom you chased and she whom you captured. I am she whom you scattered. Take me from the disgraced and crushed places. I am she who shouts aloud, and I am thrown down on the ground. I think all of a sudden, this powerful, clever, and demanding deity is clearly brutally assaulted. These scenes are gruesome, but her resistance continues to be fierce. Her voice is not silenced. She never gives up, even after being stripped bare, thrown down, and captured. And although her agony is present through the whole poem, there are other violent attacks where humiliation is not the last word. I am both awareness and obliviousness. I am humiliation and pride. I am without shame. Pay attention to me. I am she who is disgraced and she who is important. Pay attention to me, to my impoverishment and to my extravagance. So let me stop there. So that gets us far enough. There are about 15 more sayings that she has in which she is disgraced, thoroughly beaten, and never giving up. But it seems clear to me that she can't handle everything. And that what she offers is some power, but not all power, or even some power that helps, but not enough power. So I think that there is that issue that is quite clear, that this text does not hide itself from her loss and her pain. So there, I would want to say, in terms of power, it's clear that she never gives up, but she never has enough power. So this is where I find the use of the term vulnerable to characterize the only viable divinity. In other words, I myself, I think, am saying is irresponsible to portray God as all-powerful, whether diffuse or not. And I think I'm faithful to her in the way she is the kind of reality she has, which is vulnerable, beaten, powerful, and present. So I think that this lays out a little bit more of what she is. There's one other thing I'll just mention on the side of it. There's one time when she shouts, and then she's thrown to the ground. And then after she's thrown to the ground, she yells again, "I am she who shouts out, and it is I that listen." So anyway, let's hear thoughts, protests, and questions that we have as we continue through the text.
I've always struggled with the idea that God can be all powerful and humanity can truly be free.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about that with a rabbi friend of mine, and he was speaking of being created in the image of God as not being potentially all powerful or all-knowing or any of that, but actually it's the capacity to suffer. And that comes from an empathy. So when I read thunder, I hear this relationship that is ongoing between humanity and divinity, that creates great suffering, I think, for the divine life.
Thanks, John, and especially to keep the theology of Judaism front and center in this question.
Isn't it also, though, the capacity to suffer but triumph? That's, Jesus certainly suffered but triumphed. And can this not be some encouragement that no matter what horrible situation you encounter, you can rise above it. You will triumph.
Thank you. I think I lost that last sentence or two, but it's powerful stuff, and I'm glad you got Jesus in the mix. I would want to say that it doesn't seem to me that thunder triumphs. I think that she is powerful and good, but I haven't been able to find a place where she says, now I won. She, to the very end, she's falling down, getting hit, getting up again, being powerful. So that would be a question to raise. But I do think that she is, I love your word, she is in parse and triumph. It seems to me that it's a real possibility that she is viably powerful and viably encouraging, but not enough. Now, so in the material I'm about to publish, I have to say is very close to the early ways that Jesus is portrayed. And I think that much of that kind of Jesus that is very much like thunder has been covered over by the imperial theology, the theology that has to win and has to triumph. But when I look at the Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, for instance, that is a pretty puny resurrection. Just let me remind us of, and this only happens in Mark, but it happens that there Jesus cries out, yelling at God as he dies, saying, "Why have you abandoned me?" I mean, that's not triumph. And secondly, at the resurrection in Mark, in the earliest form of Mark, the women come to the tomb, they learn Jesus has been risen, and they go away and tell no one. And that's the end of the Gospel of Mark. So according to the Gospel of Mark, this is the kind of presence thunder brings, is the kind of resurrection that only is known by the people who read this book. And I'm not talking about the Bible. I'm talking about this little tiny gospel called Mark, which never knew there would be a Bible. And so there, I've got a couple of Jesus chapters, and what I think is the only viable divinity in Jesus is the one that's only partly powerful and not sufficient enough. But that is the only way we can be. There can be a viable and unshameful God. Is one that is partly powerful, the one that gets beaten up and abandoned by the Almighty. So thank you for your thinking about encouragement. You'll see my limits there, and me holding on to both these two figures in the. I mean, it's not an accident. I think that the Thunder Perfect Mind document was in what I call the Jesus jar. I mean, it was 52 texts, almost all of which were about Jesus. Now, thunder itself never uses the term Jesus, and is different than we think about Jesus, in that thunder is both female and male, mostly female. So you would say that doesn't count her as a Jesus figure. I don't know whether she would even want to be a Jesus figure, but it seems to me there's so much in common, even with Paul. So Paul says, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Paul never himself says, I've got it won. He's always talking about himself also being beaten. Anyway, yeah. So those are thoughts. Let's see if there are other respondings.
Well, I guess I would say, Hal, that that the points that you've been talking about are actually kind of moving me in the other direction. That when you said that you don't see the how did you put it, that she never finds a completeness or an end of these things, but I guess what I'm hearing in this, in a new way, for me anyway, is that going to the extremity of all the suffering and misery and belittling of humanity, she's still there talking. And to me, that's like saying, no matter what, no matter how far the disgrace can be articulated, she's still going. And that's the part that tells me, I guess, in the opposite direction from what you're saying, and that is that it's not triumphalism as much as it is, I'm not defeated. And I guess I hadn't thought about this before, but I'm seeing you're talking about Jesus in the sense that Jesus also was defeated in every possible way. And yet the story goes on. So it's the going on part of it that I'm hearing in a kind of a new way that embraces all of the worst of the Holocaust in the world. And there's something else that's still there. So you're kind of pushing me in the opposite direction I thought we were going to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's
unintentionally.
Well, but no, I think you're right close to thunder there. That is, she never gives up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she never, and in the world of the Greeks, where tragedy is the best story, she never is tragic.
Yeah.
And neither is Jesus. I mean, in my book on the Gospel of Mark, I say Mark refuses to be triumphant or tragic. Rather, a kind of active, continuing presence that is not enough but is something. And what would it be like? And this is where one of our people earlier in the conversation was talking about spiritual. So this is where I think this is where a spiritual growth is very inviting. So what would it be like for us to say, no, triumph or tragedy is not a viable way of being fully spiritual as a human being? To claim triumph is not honest or present enough. And to claim tragedy is a rejection of so much good that there is. Just because there's not enough goodness to make us happy or to save us doesn't mean that there's not real goodness.
Well, you sure are bringing to the surface the meaning of human being in a way that I think is profoundly important for us. And of course, that's why we're so intrigued with Jesus, because he requires us to think what a human being is in a way that you just can't do by looking around with our senses. There's something else going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, at least because I'm a Bible guy, I don't think that there is a consistent picture of Jesus in the New Testament,
No.
or beyond the New Testament in the early writings like Thunder. But it does seem to me that there is a fairly continuous announcement of a divine presence that is real, kind, persistent, and afraid. I'm she who exists in all fears and in trembling boldness. So yeah, we've got more to talk about, don't we, Shirley? That I appreciate the nuance with which you come back at some of these texts.
Well, as someone else said, I don't need to monopolize here, but as someone else just said, I think it's really helpful to stretch beyond the confines of what we've always thought and look at, could it mean something more in all directions? And if it does, how does that benefit us? You know, what do we do with that information?
Yeah, and this is not to knock, say, the Gospel of Luke, but what's happened to the Gospel of Mark is its courage and realness about the presence of pain has been just submerged by, let's say, Luke, in which, Luke takes out Jesus's cursing God on the cross and says, basically, everything's all right.
What about the recognition or the throwing into the mix the fact that the my God, why hast thou forsaken me was quoting Psalms, and that the possibility exists that Jesus was saying, I am that guy. This was already, we've been talking about this in the temple. We have read this, and bringing up the psalm to his audience rather than it just being cursing God.
Yeah, I've lost you, but I've not lost your thought. Are you finished? Because we keep losing you. So
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm finished. I was just wanting to refer back to that Psalms.
No, it's really
the concept of quoting.
No, it's one of my favorite Psalms, and so here's the way this is actually the way I've read that psalm even before I began to understand Mark. So it looks to me as if Psalm 22 is actually two psalms together. If you look from verses 1 to 18 or 19, you have basically what is a picture of what is a fairly common person in Israel, and that's someone who has been kicked off their land and has had their property taken away from them, even the shirt off their back. And there, what that voice says is, I've lost everything. God, help me. Why aren't you helping me like you helped mom and dad? And that's all in the first person, basically. Then the voice changes immediately, and to the third person, in which everything turns out a lot. So it doesn't lose the picture of the person who just lost his farm, but got added when they decided everybody's been praying this temple, this passage of God, please help me when I'm losing everything, and said, God's coming to help you. But it's in a different voice. So I think that, yes, this is very similar to where I am. I think that Psalm 22 was absolutely picked up by Mark as an ingenious way of saying, yes, Jesus is as lost as all of those farmers who lost their property. So there's some kind of hope there. But I would want to say the second voice in Psalm 22 does go a bit too far for me if I'm going to sleep at night with those 6,000 Jews. So there, I think your point in the third third of that psalm is making your point. I think the first 2/3 of the psalm are actually really close to Jesus cursing at God and dying. So great stuff at every turn this evening, and I know it's over right now, but at every turn our discussion has been right on the money with really important material. So thank you so much. I hope we have some more time to do this, and Shirley, you'll help us think through whether we should return to this conversation itself or go on to some more texts. Oops, I'm not hearing you, Shirley.
Yes, thank you. I'm back on. To your point, thank you, Hal, for mentioning that, because I think that would be great to get some feedback on where we go next and what people would like to hear. You can go to the Facebook Early Christian Text and leave comments there about this. I think you can also do it on an Early Christian Text as a place for comments. So it would be helpful to hear your feedback on what you'd like to further discuss, if you have more questions on what we'd like to have from Tanho. So yeah, this is great.
And I'd be happy to answer any comments on that venue.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hal. This is very rich as always. You leave us with a willingness to go back and think a little bit more, and that's where you want to leave us. And I'm going to just conclude here by just commenting here that a great thanks to everybody for participating. This was the September 2019 Tanho Monday Textual Study Discussion on the Thunder Perfect Mind Part 2, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month from 8 to 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the fourth Monday of the month, the Tanho Center sponsors a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Each session is led by a trained scholar who shares a well-framed overview of the particular text and allows discussion participants time to share their insights as well. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. To donate, simply click on the Town Home Monday Textual Studies button on the Early Christian Text homepage. Thank you so much.